It's 14.3, lesson 14.3, change within isolation. In what ways did isolation lead to political, economic, and social changes in Japanese society? So stick around and let's learn something. Lesson 14.3. In this lesson, we will learn the ways isolation led to political, economic, and social change in Japanese society. This is change within isolation. So we are going to go at the same period of time that this is happening, the change that had happened in Unit 1, which was Renaissance Europe. That was a positive change. Change was beneficial to European society. And when we view the change that took place in Europe, we see that there was no limit to the good in which it brought. People became smarter, more opportunities were available, new technologies were invented, but not so much with Japan. Or was it? And that's what this lesson is going to be taking a look at. So first, we're going to take a look at some attitudes towards change. When MacDonald arrived in 1848, when he was set adrift from the whaling ship, the Plymouth, he arrived in Japan. He landed in Japan, and it seemed like a world apart in terms of culture. There was very little change within the 250 years that Japan was in its period of isolation. And this made such a unique society within Japan. And they were working towards an ideal society. We were looking in Japan at peace, safety, and security. Peace, safety, and security leads to harmony, respect, and a very strict social class structure where everyone has a place. And it was safe. It's very important to remember that there was peace and safety. And when you have peace, and when there is a sense of safety and you've got security there, it gives people time to think about other activities. So they have more leisure time all of a sudden. So now we can focus on the sports, on art, on crafts, and on entertainment because we don't have to worry about other things. The peace, the safety, the security, the harmony, the respect, and where everyone has its place, and the leisure time will definitely come at a cost. This only happened because of the rigid rules that were in place, those exclusion laws that we talked about in the previous lesson. Those exclusion laws led to very rigid rules, and you weren't allowed to move within your class structure. Along with that, with those rigid rules, we also see that we have in Japan at this time no personal freedoms and very little to no expression. But even though that came at a cost, we do have some good things that came out of this. Okay? We have a booming economy. That stability and that peace meant that Japanese people were becoming more wealthy, and farmers were increasing their production because they could spend more time tending to their farms as opposed to training to overthrow the shogun, for example. Let's say, I don't know, let's just use that one, okay? And during times of peace, you can go out, you can do all kinds of projects. So we're going to have improved roads. In times of peace, you don't have to worry, so your population is going to increase. And then slowly, instead of rice being used as currency, we've got silver and gold being introduced as money. Wonder where that came from, However, the economy compared to the rest of the world was still being held back because there was very little foreign trade. The Koreans, the Chinese, and the Dutch, there's only so much you can trade with them, right? So compared to other countries, very little foreign trade. The peasants were being heavily taxed still. Seems like the peasants are always being heavily taxed. And they were still, despite the fact that they were trying to move to a silver and gold currency, rice was still the main form of payment. Even though they were trying to wean their way off of rice, it was still being used as their main form of payment. That's from an economic point of view. But that didn't change the culture of Japan. And I mentioned earlier that the culture of Japan is a very unique culture compared to many other cultures. All cultures are unique, but Japanese culture is extremely unique. And during this period of isolation, this was their golden age of culture. You've got peace. You've got some level of prosperity, which means there's some wealth there. That will ultimately lead to a flourishing culture. So you don't have to worry about making ends meet. You don't have to worry about maintaining the necessities and the basics of life. You can now focus on the arts, on culture. So take a look at what you like to do yourself when you've got some free time. Many of you are learning to play a musical instrument. Many of you draw. You take part in sports or some other physical activity. When there's peace and prosperity, you have time to focus on your hobbies and the things that you really enjoy. And during this golden age of culture, we have all kinds of activities taking place. We've got sumo wrestling here. You see the picture there. You've got kabuki, traditional Japanese tea ceremonies. Google it. It's a really interesting cultural thing that takes place. We have banraku. We have kendo, sport. Haiku. This is a form of expression. This is poetry. You know what haikus are. It seems like you've been writing haikus since elementary school. All of these activities were really flourishing during this age, this golden age of culture, because they didn't have to worry about security. They could focus more on themselves and on these activities. And because the social structure was so rigid, they didn't have the opportunities to move up and down, so they stayed within their social structure, and these activities flourished. However, there's always a however, isn't there, in these lessons in social studies. However, there was some kind of like underground, some underground things that were taking place, and these were called the floating worlds. These were places where people could go. Despite your status, you could go and you could mix with people from different levels in the hierarchy. These places had more relaxed rules. You didn't have to stay within your social class because money talks. Okay? There's a lesson here, kids. Money talks. Okay? It's always talked. It will continue to talk. Money talks. So money in these floating worlds definitely counted more than your status on the social hierarchy. Now, at first, the shogun didn't like this. Okay, they didn't like the people mingling. They didn't like the cross of the social classes. So he did try to suppress these floating worlds, but probably through his advisors, he decided that he's going to place these floating worlds under surveillance, and the shogun will send spies in. The shogun will send his people in to monitor what's happening in these floating worlds. Because what's going to happen in these floating worlds, when you have the social classes mixing, you've got people who are going to be talking more freely, maybe not paying that close attention to what they are saying. So maybe a plot to overtake the shogun might start to develop. So being under surveillance, sending these spies in, they can then report back to the shogun. And if anything needs to be kind of squashed or maintained, the shogun can then go and do that. All right, I want you to head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.